Some of our earliest written accounts offer a sense of the medieval attitude to those whose physicality or behaviour differed from perceived norms. Explanations of these forms of difference tended to draw on a religious framework, and thus there was a mystic association with some physical and psychological differences. To the modern ear, the language used in these historical treatments can feel distasteful. But the social positioning of these individuals was, in many ways, better than those who experienced subsequent eras. The term natural fools was, for instance, used to refer to individuals with some mental illness. Though the negative association with this is partly a modern invention. They were treated as closer to God, and afforded a degree of respect as sources of innocent wisdom and humour. Without formal state institutions, care for these individuals fell with friends and family, and they would supplement income as the village beggar. This is hardly a romantic or fulfilling existence, but it is one which is fundamentally embedded in community. Disabled people lived as a visible presence amongst mainstream society. This was something that was to shift over the 400 years that followed, as orientations became gradually institutionalised. Through the Middle Ages, the Church gradually increased support for disability, with a network of hospitals and almshouses to provide food, shelter and care. This was a charitable act, of course, but it was also one which began to sever the connections between disabled people and the communities from which they originated. With the dissolution of monasteries under Henry VIII, the hospital infrastructure collapsed, and with it, many disabled people were left destitute. It began a process by which such individuals began to be conceptualised as a problem or a sickness within society, away from religious and quasi-mystical discourses on disability, to one which focused on a medicalised model, or, more commonly, one of dependency. In turn, those who were physically and behaviourally different became lumped amongst the general category of the social undesirables. They were not quite as stigmatised as those termed the undeserving poor, but they were still negatively framed. Subsequent centuries saw those perceived as socially undesirable become gradually swept away from mainstream society and into institutions, a process that Foucault calls the Great Confinement. The outcome for the individuals involved were varied. Those who were lucky found themselves in specialised institutions, such as schools for the deaf. Many, however, found themselves amongst the rest of society's undesirables, in the workhouses and prisons of Victorian Britain. Regardless, the results of this process were fundamental. They completed the process of dislocating the disabled from mainstream society. It was a dislocation that was stubborn in its persistence. Thus, when state schooling was gradually introduced through the late 19th and early 20th century, it was established along segregationist lines. Particular diagnostic criteria were applied to children in order to sort the educable from the uneducable, the latter of whom were placed under the remit of health services rather than education. It was not until 1970 and the Handicapped Children's Act that this situation shifted. It outlawed the excuse that some children were uneducable and compelled local education authorities to ensure that schooling support was available to all children according to their needs. In practice, this provision was still segregated, though it ensured that at least some access to learning was available to all. Perhaps the most significant challenge to all of this came in 1978 with a report on special educational needs by Mary Warnock. It was highly critical of the segregation experienced by many children, the social exclusion that resulted, and the limits it imposed on their life chances. Warnock suggested that whilst 20% of the population might have some form of SEN, only 2% had needs which required them to be educated out of the mainstream. The rest could and should be taught amongst their peers, with a statement of SEN which set out appropriately matched resourcing and educational goals. The work of Warnock was significant, in that it introduced an integrative model of SEN, one that directly challenged the segregationist approach. In the 1981 Education Act, these principles were enshrined in law. Local authorities were compelled to assess and provide mainstream support for children with SEN, and to give parents of these children stronger choices in where they were educated. They were, however, offered a loophole, in that integration should make efficient use of government resources, and that it shouldn't damage the progression of other children. This caveat is an interesting conceptual one, as it places the rights of non-SEN children above those with diagnoses of particular needs. This tendency was undermined in 1994 with the United Nations Salamanca Statement, a declaration which set out that it was a child's human right to be included in mainstream education and in society. This discourse of inclusion was significant. It moved the emphasis away from a fairly passive process of physically locating children in the mainstream, as had happened in the integrative model. Instead, it emphasised a more active process by which the mainstream accepted those individuals and through which institutions accommodated and enabled their involved participation. These principles were embedded in law, firstly in a 1997 Green Paper, and then in the 2001 Special Needs and Disability Act, or SENDA, a policy which remains the dominant legal framework surrounding SEN and disability. It made illegal discrimination, active or accidental, which disadvantaged disabled people, and to make reasonable adjustments in order to enable their participation to the fullest degree possible. There have, of course, been further refinements to this policy and educational reinterpretations of it, though I leave to another podcast a focus on the current policy landscape. Here, I have offered a sense of the longer picture, of how the language we now use to talk around SEN and disability have evolved. In doing so, it's interesting to observe that the debates surrounding inclusion and SEN are more than just questions of functional education, though of course this is important. It's equally a matter of the shifting relationships between society and a particular group of its citizens, of dislocation and of relocation of disabled people amongst the communities in which they belong. For practitioners, and those interested in education in general, this treatment frames up an interesting question of the degree to which integrationist or even segregationist orientations to physical, emotional and behavioural difference might still percolate under the surface allusion to inclusionist discourse and practice.